in a few minutes if there are people that are running late. So today we have, this morning, we have a series of very interesting seminars. And the first one will be by Professor Han Fimbo. He worked as a research fellow at the European Organization of Nuclear Research in Geneva, and now he's an assistant research professor in the Aarhus University in Denmark. And I should say that his contribution to physics is very wide and extremely impressive. And today he's going to talk us about the 3-alpha system using decay and reaction experiments. So you have about 1 hour. And if there are questions, just post in the chat and we will pass them to the speaker during the presentation. And please, thank you.
Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Where is it? PowerPoint. There. So can you see my screen now?
Perfectly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So as you said, I will today talk about some work I'm doing on the 3-alpha kind of system. As you also alluded to, my research is experimental nuclear physics, nuclear astrophysics, the physics of isotopes far from stable isotopes. What are the properties of very short-lived isotopes? But I have also a line of research which deals with the stable nuclei like carbon-12, and that is maybe of more interest for this critical stability school and workshop. So let me try to say a little bit of what are the themes of this line of research and of this presentation. So of course, in nuclear physics, we deal with a few or many body physics with a strong interaction in general. So that in itself is a fairly complicated problem. To be more specific, what I'm doing in this line of research with carbon-12 is to understand to what degree can we understand such strongly interacting many-body systems built out of maybe protons and neutrons and quarks, of course, also sometimes as clustered structures of where some of the nucleons go together and form, for example, helium nuclei or alpha particles, and therefore the effective degrees of freedom are then not the protons and neutrons, but maybe these alpha particles. How do these states decay? If we look over here to the right, we have a kind of a schematic drawing of the nucleus of carbon-12 and how above a certain energy you enter into different continua, states or structures that are unbound. So the first continuum that one meets is the triple alpha continuum. So any structure above that energy is able to break up into 3 alpha particles. And then there are other continua higher up. You can emit protons and neutrons, and you can also form resonances between pairs of alpha particles. So you can talk about maybe also these type of 2-particle continua. So it's a complicated situation where one has to understand how can we understand these structures inside or resonances in this continuum, and how do these resonances decay. So I've tried to make this kind of overview here. So this kind of cartoon here deals with the first certain sets of questions dealing with what are the resonances, the energies, the width, other properties of the resonances or continuum states inside, let's say carbon-12 in this case. Are we talking with resonances, or are there non-resonant contributions? What is the structure of those states lying inside these resonances? Are they cluster states? Are they many-body states, as I alluded to earlier? And then there are questions related to, okay, how do these resonances sitting in the continuum then decay down to smaller entities? What is the mechanism of this breakup? Is it happening somehow stepwise, or are the particles coming out at the same time? And what is the relation between that decay mechanism and the structure of this initial state. If a certain decay mechanism sort of dominates here, does that tell me something about what this resonance looks inside the resonance, or what is that connection? And finally, what are the asymptotic spectra that one then meets in a detector in an experiment, and what is the relation between those spectra and the initial state? So this is sort of kind of an overview of the kind of questions that I'm trying to address in this line of research. So I thought I would give kind of a historical introduction to starting with questions of this type over here, resonances, where they are, what they mean, what role they play. And then in the second half, going more towards this mechanism on final state spectra type questions. So there's a very, very long history of research in this type of question. And it perhaps, well, it probably started already in the 30s with Wheeler and some other people looking into to this nuclei that could be seen as a number of alpha particles. But this question of resonance is really kicked off by this famous paper that many people have heard about, but it's very difficult to find. So this deals with the formation of carbon-12 in the universe. And so there is a paper here from the Caltech group Kellogg lab, where Willy Fowler was the leader, where they talks about Salpeter and Öpik has pointed out that the importance of this Brillouin alpha reaction leading to carbon-12 formation. But then Fred Hoyle has said that in order for this to explain the observed abundances of oxygen, carbon, and helium, there needs to be a resonance. So this is this famous prediction by Fred Hoyle that there has to be a resonance inside carbon-12 just by looking at the elements, the abundance of the elements. So that led to the experimental identification that there was such a resonance just above the threshold for triple alpha decay in carbon-12. Indeed, that was true, what Hoyle predicted. And then later on, there was another paper here by Japanese physicist Morinaga, who was at that time was in Indiana in the US. So this is just 3 years later, where he is trying to interpret this state in a sort of a physical model. What is the properties of that state, and what can one deduce from those properties? So he, in this paper, not only looked at carbon-12, but as you can see here, at a number of these nuclei that can be seen as a number of alpha particles. So beryllium-8 can be seen perhaps as 2 alpha particles or 2 helium nuclei, and carbon-12 3, oxygen-16 4, neon-20 5, and so on. And then he, starting with beryllium-8, he identified that looks like there is this kind of 0+ ground state, and then there's a 2+ and a 4+ that can be seen as like a rotational band type thing, so that this is a deformed structure, which somehow makes sense if you have 2 alpha particles sitting next to each other. But then, so this is sitting just above the threshold for 2 alpha decay in this case, and then this state here predicted by Hoyle should then maybe be the lowest member of another rotational band. So there should be then also be 2+ and 4+ states in this system, and similar in oxygen-16 and so on. So that was an early idea by Morinaga. So this was it's not based on much calculation apart from just identifying rotational bands. So you could ask, where are we today, 50 or 70 years later? So to answer that kind of question, I just show you this little bit busy slide here. So to the left, there's a table of theoretical predicted values, and to the right, there is a table of sort of the latest evaluation of states in carbon-12. And it looks rather, if we start to the right, rather messy. There are lots of states in brackets here, meaning that they're not really well known or sort of suggested to exist. So that surprises many people that even in a system like carbon-12, which is a stable nucleus, there are in fact open questions we don't know, even experimentally. In particular related to where are these 2+ states here that was predicted by Morinaga. To the left then is the theoretical calculation. This is from a paper on the archive that you can find by Dean Lee and his collaborators, Wolf-Georg Meissner. And and so on. So this is a calculation type called a lattice nuclear calculation, where it's a little bit inspired by lattice QCD that some of you probably know, but not using QCD, but effective field theory based interactions, but then solved with a lattice type calculation. So it gives you an idea of how one can predict nowadays, sort of in some kind of ab initio type calculation, how well one can then predict resonances in a system like carbon-12. And you can see there's a certain parameter length scale that one can vary in this type of lattice calculations, and you see the variation in the energies. And you can see to some extent how these calculations match with known experimental values. So maybe within an MEV, one can calculate these things nowadays in such a model. There's still lots of work to do in both measuring and calculating these kind of questions. So why is it not solved on the experimental side? So just to give you an idea why this is so difficult, let me show you here. This is another recent paper from the archive from a facility in Cape Town, near Cape Town in South Africa. So this is an experiment where you shoot protons or alpha particles onto a target of carbon-12, and then you do inelastic excitation. And you analyze the scattered beam in this spectrometer here, measure the scattered particle in a detector array, and then at the same time you measure what are the emitted particles from the target that has been excited to an excited state. These busy plots here show you here on the x-axis the excitation energy that you have managed to excite using this scattered beam. And then on this y-axis here, you then measure or see what are the energies of particles detected here at the focal plane from the decay of those excited states. So you see, if you have a low excitation energy, you get a low energy particle emitted. That kind of makes sense. So if you excite an energy just above the threshold, then of course you get low energy particles out. And then as you increase the excitation energy, you get more and more high energy particles coming out. So this line here basically just tells you that the energy can only be up to a certain value given by the excitation energy. But there are certain bands here that tells you something about the decay mechanism. So this is related to what I was alluding to earlier, that when you have these states sitting in a three-body continuum, then the decay mechanism can be difficult. So that is when you go to some specific excitation energy, let's say here, and then you see that the energy is distributed in some specific way. One has to understand, why are certain energies emitted more than others? What is the mechanism behind those spectra? That is what I will come back to in more detail in the latter part of this seminar. The job for the experimentalist now is to see, okay, how can I understand all these data in terms of resonances or continuum structure inside the excited target nucleus? And you can see when they do that in that experiment that you can find on the archive, it looks like this. So you see it's a mess of different resonance structures that are very wide. So some of them are more narrow and easier to identify, but others are wide and overlapping. So it's not so easy to do this in a unique way. So this is state-of-the-art work, I think, from last year. So it tells you that this is both difficult from an experimental point of view and from a theoretical point of view. So that was kind of a background to why we are still talking about these things in 2021 for even a stable nucleus like carbon-12. So I can tell you a little bit about what is it that my approach to this kind of problems. Yeah, I put some arrows here to some of the things that one can. So what is the experimental problem here? Why this is difficult is that when you do this type of experiment, you can excite almost everything. So whenever there's some resonance, you can excite it. There is some degree of selectivity by analyzing what is the angular distribution of the scattered particle, but it's not so easy to disentangle the different multipolarities that you populate in such a reactor. So my idea many years ago was that let's try to use some other method that has a higher degree of selectivity. And the method that I chose to use was to use the weak interaction, the beta decay, if you wish. And the idea with that is that you have then selection rules in when you have such decays, so that you only populate certain spins and parities in the daughter nuclei, and therefore you can get selectivity towards some of the states that you want to study. And in this case, you have indeed radioactive isotopes that decay into carbon-12, nitrogen-12, and boron-12. And it so happens that the spins of these states is a 1+, both of them, of course, because they're mirror nuclei. And that means that you can, in allowed transitions, populate 2+ states and 0+ states, which are the mostly interesting ones from the point of view of that old paper by Morinaga. So there's a hope one can use this technique to solve some of these questions. I don't know, some of you may not be well acquainted with beta decay, so I thought I would just give you a little reminder on how this works. So in beta decay, we talk about something called the Fermi function. I hope you've all heard about that in some course. And there's a matrix element, of course, that tells you about the overlap between the initial decaying state and the daughter state. And somehow the branching ratio that you observe in an experiment is related to the product of such a phase space factor and this matrix element. This phase space factor is highly energy dependent. It goes as the energy to the 5th power, roughly, what's called Sargent's rule. So that means in a decay like the ones that I'm talking about here, this phase space factor will fall down rapidly as you approach the endpoint energy in the decay. So as you go up here in the highest energy spectrum. But this is, if you then measure both of these decay, these two mirror nuclei, then you know that these two spectra will be modified in a different way by these known functions. You can calculate these functions relatively easily. This is not so easy because when you do this, if you manage to produce these isotopes in the first place, and that's already a challenge because the half-life is of the order of 10 or 20 milliseconds. So you have to be able to produce them and then get them to your experiment and study their decay within that time. But then once you've managed to do that, the fraction of the decays that populate this region of interest in the continuum that I'm talking about is only 1 to 3%. Depending on the isotope, whereas most of the decays actually just goes to the ground state, which is not so interesting for understanding what's happening in the continuum, obviously. So you need to make a lot of these isotopes in order to study them. So this is just to give you a little bit of an idea of the type of thing you then expect to see when you do this type of experiment. So this is kind of a rough introduction to what we call R-matrix theory, and is used a lot by experimentalists to understand this type of data. So I guess if you start down here, it looks a bit like that you all know a Breit-Wigner profile, where you have up here in the numerator what you can think of as just the width of the state. It's energy dependent because of the fact that you have a Coulomb barrier. So the emission of a charged particle is of course energy dependent when there is a Coulomb barrier that one has to transmit. You know that from alpha decay, that the half-life of alpha decay is very strongly energy dependent. So therefore, when you have such a resonance sitting inside a charged particle resonance, there will also be an energy dependent width, which is standing up here. And that's the same one that is written down here. Otherwise, it's just looking like a Breit-Wigner. There's also an energy dependent function here called a delta that one can calculate. So I've just used that formula up here to plot sort of line profiles you would expect using this kind of formula. So where these arrows indicate the energy that is put into the formula where the resonance is supposed to be. So you see, if you place a resonance just above the threshold, it sits at the energy that you put in, at least. So the maximum of the peak is where you put it in this value. But then it has a high energy tail here. So there's a kind of feature that is a surprise to most people, that if you just look narrow in the vicinity of this peak, it looks like a Breit-Wigner peak with a small width. But then because the Coulomb barrier becomes smaller and smaller as you get higher and higher energy, it gets this kind of secondary tail here. If you then move further away from the threshold, you get this green curve here that looks maybe more like a normal peak. It has a slightly higher tail towards higher energy because again of the Coulomb barrier. And then as you see, as you move higher and higher, the peaks at lower energies as where you put the energy in. Sorry, because of this function here. So it's you have to. It's not so easy when you have the data to actually find out where should you place the resonance, but you need this to use this kind of formalism here. It was a very brief introduction to our matrix theory. So let me turn to some of the experiments we've done. So I'll show you some older results, although we are right now analyzing a new generation of experiments, but I'm not ready to show that to you yet. So the general idea of how we do this is that you go to a place like there's a from CERN scale small facility called ISOLDE at CERN. It stands for Isotope Separation Online. Damn expensive. Some people say that DE stands for, but it's a facility that is designed for making radioactive isotopes and studying them fast. So from that facility, you can dial in and you can then get delivered beams of these isotopes with maybe between 30 and 60 kilovolt energy, kinetic energy. So low energy beams that you can stop in thin foils, and therefore you then get a sample of radioactive isotopes. So you just have to wait for them to decay. You don't have to wait long, as I said, because the half-life is only 10 or 20 milliseconds. And then you have to put around that detectors that are able to measure the position and energy of those emitted particles from the decay. So then you get the data looking like this. So it looked kind of, if you remember what I showed you from the experiment in Itemba in South Africa, the same. So here on the x-axis, we have again the excitation energy that is now populated in the beta decay of such a nucleus. And then again on the y-axis, you have the energy of particles emitted from different excited states. And down here, we have the then projection down on the excitation energy axis so that you can see that there are certain peaks. So there must be a resonance here corresponding to these three regions here. And there's also another structure here, lower energy, that looks more hard to interpret. And then if you see for a specific excitation energy, let's say here 3 MeV, you see that the energy is split in a specific way for that excitation energy. There is one particle coming out with roughly 2 MeV in this lying in this region. And down here, there's kind of a broad bank because that's where 2 alpha particles are coming out. So this is a specific kinematical pattern that corresponds to having a stepwise decay where 1 alpha particle is going one direction and 2 are going together as a beryllium nucleus, and then that splits up after about 10 to the minus 16 seconds. So much earlier than the particles are hitting the detector. So this is telling us that this excitation energy decays in a specific way, stepwise. Whereas over here it looks differently. They have these 3 peaks. I will come back to what this means later. Yeah, and then the problem with this type of experiment is that when you do this, stopping the isotope in this kind of foil, there is this foil has to have a certain thickness of the order of hundreds of nanometers. So it's not large, but it's not small. It's not zero. So that means that some of the particles, if you have very low energy particles emitted, maybe less than 200 kilovolt or something, then they will actually stick inside this foil. They will experience an energy loss and then not be able to get out. So there is a certain energy cutoff due to that reason. And that's why we do not observe things below this energy here of maybe 800 kV, something like that. And we know there is this important peak that I started the talk by telling you about here at just 400 kilovolt above the peak of the threshold. So in that sense, this experiment is suffering from that shortback. So in order to solve that problem, we've done a complementary experiment here where the idea is that instead of doing 20 or 30 or 60 kilovolt, you accelerate these beams up to 4 to 5 MeV per nucleon. So something like 55 MeV total energy. And when you do that, then you can deposit these beams in a sufficient depth inside a detector that the full energy emitted when the nucleus decays is contained within the detector. and therefore you can measure the summed energy of all the particles emitted. The beta particle will just go out because it does not deposit much energy in a detector. And therefore we were able to then measure the full excitation spectrum. So this is what is shown. I'll just focus on the lower plot here, which is on the x-axis. We have the summed energy of the three particles, which is basically just the excitation energy minus the energy of the threshold. So now we see this peak here. So if you compare to the previous plot, you see this peak here we saw in the previous data here, this one. But now we see that the data extends down to further in a lower energy, and we see this peak that is the first resonance above the threshold. But again, we see now there is this very peculiar, strange structure between these two normal-looking resonances. And also above that one, there's also some structure here, and there's another peak here that is weakly populated because it's close to the endpoint. I show you this data also because there was a paper last year, and even from this year, related to the FMOP effect, which I think is discussed in this school. So there was a paper by I think it was a Japanese group that suggested that there should be such an FMOP state, and that relates to earlier suggestions of that nature. And that FMOP state should be sitting down here below this peak in the vicinity of where this lightly green peak is sitting. This lightly green peak is from decays where there are only beta particles emitted, so going to bound states here. So this paper asked the question, is there such a resonance below this peak that could be an FMOP state? We cannot use this data to look for that because we have this background of beta particles, but I'll come back to another way that this can be done. And that is exactly this way here.
Hans?
Yeah.
I have a question. I will break the ice with a question. We returned probably on the FMOP state before, but can you briefly explain what I'm seeing the previous slide in the top two graphics, the red spot?
Yeah, so I didn't, this is simply just, so this detector that we used here for the experiment was it was about 2 centimeter by 2 centimeter detector, segmented into 32 strips in each direction, vertical and horizontal, as far as I remember. So what you see here is the pattern of implantation of the event. I mean, when you shoot in a beam of, let's say, in this case, nitrogen-12, you record in which pixel did the beam implant. That's the left part of this plot. And then the right part of the plot is, okay, in which pixel do I then see subsequently within some time window of maybe 50 milliseconds or something like that, we can choose that. Do I then see a subsequent decay? And the meaning of this plot is just to say that the decay events follow the same pattern as the implantation events. So that you know that it's not that somehow you are measuring some kind of background. And this type of plot is particularly relevant when you look for this low energy peak because it's very close to our threshold. So if you do this kind of plot for this peak, you get the same pattern here. So it's just to convince people that what we measure is related to where we implant the ion that decays. So that's the meaning of that plot.
Thank you very much.
So in order to, since this level here is very close to the threshold, it can not only decay by emitting alpha particles. It is sitting in the continuum, so therefore it can break up into to fragments, but it can also electromagnetically decay. So it's sitting over here. Can you see my mouse when I move around here, I guess? So it can also emit a gamma ray here and then another gamma ray down to the ground state. That's in fact how carbon is produced in the universe, because if the resonance was just decaying back to alpha particles or helium nuclei, then there would never be carbon formed. So there is a 10 to the minus 4 roughly branching ratio for emitting a gamma ray. So indeed, if there was another resonance lying here, such an FMOP state, then that is even closer to the threshold, and therefore it would predominantly decay by electromagnetic emission, not by particle emission, because its Coulomb barrier would be even higher than it is from this state here. So looking for such a state, and also for other reasons, we went to the experiment or the setup called Gammasphere in Argonne National Lab. It's probably in wider circles mainly known from appearing in the movie Hulk that some of you may have seen. A Hollywood film. There's this green monster, Hulk, that in that film he got irradiated by beams from the Gammasphere detector. So in that film, the Gammasphere was not a detector but a source of gamma rays for some reason. That's just anecdotal information. But they have this nice detector of 100 germanium detectors sitting in a sphere. So it's the a very good detector if you want to go and measure extremely rare gamma decays, which is the case here. So we went there to see whether we could measure the gamma decay of this state here, and also look for such an Efimov state. In fact, we didn't know that was the reason that we didn't know that interest, because we did this experiment before that paper. But I'll show you that it can be used to exclude that possibility. So over here, you see the gamma ray, the most weak gamma ray, the ones coming here, this red one here. And we can also measure the angular distribution between these two gamma rays here, this one and this one. And that has a characteristic shape that one expects when looking at the angular momentum and parities of these excited states here. But just to come back to this Efimov question, if there had been such an Efimov state, there should have been another gamma ray sitting here at a specific energy that one can calculate based on the prediction of where that should be. And then you see there is no such peak. Not much to my surprise, but at least we can now experimentally exclude that. There's also, if you look in the literature, so this branching ratio here is very important for astrophysicists to know what that is, because that is directly telling you how fast you make carbon in certain stars, red giant stars. There's been a paper last year, 2020, where Tibor Kibedi and his collaborators, they said that this value is actually wrong. It should not be 0.04, but 0.06, which is a huge change. Another thing one can use this data for here is to say that, to estimate what that number is, because we know how much this level is populated from the experiments we did with implantation that I showed you before. And we also now know how often these two gamma rays are emitted in this decay. So we can then divide by how many times this level is populated, and therefore derive this number. See, so and doing that, we confirm the old value. So this new paper here is not in agreement with our data, and also not in agreement with all the previous measurements. So there's something that indicates that that might be wrong. So, okay, now this is a complicated spectrum or slide. And this is just to show you now, if I want to, let me browse a little bit. How do I understand such a structure like this here? This broad things here. It's a little bit related to what I showed you before with these peak profiles when you move close to the threshold and move from away from the threshold. So here we have a resonance that is lying close to the threshold. So we expect this one to have this secondary tail away from we have to have a peak, and then there should be some other contribution. So one could ask, is this structure here, is that simply just the high energy tail of this peak due to the proximity of the threshold? That question was actually asked all the way back in 1963 by a person called Dennis Wilkinson. Well known, he's the one who invented the multi-channel analyzer that many experimentalists are using. Nuclear physicist Sir Dennis Wilkinson, I should say, he was knighted before he died. So when he asked that, he said that it was actually 50% of this structure here could be understood, but not the full thing. Simply the intensity here is too high to be explained by that phenomenon. So one has to add other things in here. In some sense, that is nice, because then could maybe be that this is then those states that Morinaga was predicting many years ago. So we're talking about how can we understand this region here in terms of structures in the continuum. And so in order to do that, we have this, now we're talking about, we have several resonances, not just one that I showed you before, that can decay into several resonances in sort of after emitting one particle, and then going finally to the final state here. And this, in order to do that, one has this ugly looking expressions here where one has this kind of level matrices that involves the coherent population of several states that can interfere with each other. So this this kind of structure here can interfere with higher lying populated resonances, and you get from that effect complicated looking spectra. I will not go into detail what this all means, but the physical content of it is that you have several states that you can populate, and they can overlap and thereby coherently interfere with each other and make not easily interpretable spectra. Yeah, so we try to use this formalism to understand this data here. So this is what these plots are showing you, and then by doing that, you find that you have to put in resonance at certain places around 11 MeV. So you see here around this energy, there should be both 0+ and 2+ type structure. So there is some indication in this type of data that indeed there should be not only 0+ but also 2+ resonances. But even so, that what should we say, sad message compared to this other type of experiment that they did in South Africa and other places, the spectra are easier to interpret because you don't have all the other states that are populated here. But nevertheless, it's not easy because the structures are so broad that they're not easy to interpret. So then there's another idea that I will just show you quickly that popped up. And the idea was, now we've seen that one can use the weak interaction to study this type of thing. What about, instead of using beta decay or weak interaction, what can one do with the electromagnetic interaction? And the idea was, can one do something to populate some states up here, higher up in the continuum, some maybe narrower state? For those of you who are nuclear physicists, it could be some isospin, higher isospin states, which tend to be more narrow. And then let's populate those states and then see how do they gamma decay down, because we also have good selection rules for gamma decay. So that's the idea. You populate some states. So here I show you quickly, and you don't have to look at any of the numbers. You just have to see that there are certain relatively narrow states. There's 5 keV here, isospin 1 states of various energy that one can populate, and they will have not negligible decay down to the ground state. And so that idea we've been used, actually that is an experiment we can do home here at the Aarhus University, where we have small accelerators, which is nice. So we don't have to go to CERN to do this, we can just do it at home. So the idea is the same. So instead of weak interaction, we just use the gamma decay instead of beta decay. But otherwise it looks more the same. So here you have the same kind of plot here. So by doing that, so here we populate one specific resonance here, and you see that you get the same kind of spectra, this kind of a kinematical plot here, where you see population of a specific decay kinematics, and you see peaks when you project this down to the energy axis here, corresponding to states that are populated in gamma decay. I will not go into detail with this in the interest of time. But it is indeed possible to use gamma decay to get some of the same information, and that allows you to populate also states with other spins and parities, because then you can, by selecting states with, for example, 3- up here, you can then probe not only 0+ and 2+, but also 4+ and so on. So that's an idea. So now I come to the idea of how do these states decay. So now I've talked a lot about resonances up here, which are there, but let's talk about how do they decay. How do the spectra look like? What do they look like for different cases? And the interest in that, at least in my case, comes back to a paper that I was given when I was a PhD student here at Aarhus University. It's a paper by Alexei Kosheninikov from the Kurchatov Institute. So he had this paper from 1990 where he calculated, let's say if you populate a state in carbon-12, a 1+ state, also a 2- state. Then one can formulate how this decay amplitude should look in the basis of hyperspherical harmonics. I think some of you are probably acquainted with this. It's kind of a generalized hyperspherical, what do they call them? Spherical harmonics functions to more particles. So he used this to analyze the properties of these decays. And then he says the results obtained on the expected decay properties of these states indicate that the corresponding experiments should be carried out. It's a very sort of a terse conclusion, which I found quite funny. But so he predicted this kind of funny diagram here for how the energy should be distributed when you have a decay of such a state, a 1+ state, going into 3 alpha particles. So that's pretty funny. Let's see whether we can measure that. I'll come back to that later. The way we visualize these decays is using something called a Dalitz plot that probably some of you have heard in your particle physics courses or something like that. It's a diagram where you plot the energies, where you have a 3-body decay, and you plot the energy in such a diagram where the energy is the distance from these axes here. So let's say you have an event here, then energy of one particle is here, the other one is here, and the third one is here. And then it's simply such that energy conservation places the events inside such a triangle here, simply from the fact that the sum of these lengths is given by the height of this triangle. And then momentum conservation, depending on whether it's relativistic or non-relativistic, is restricted to a smaller area. If it's non-relativistic, it's restricted to this circle here, if it's 3 particles with the same mass. So we can then have these energies distributed inside the circle. And then if you have, as in the case here of carbon-12, you have intermediate resonances, you get these kind of bands here corresponding to a specific energy being emitted more likely than others. And if you have 3 identical particles, you get 3 bands in a symmetrical way like this. So the nice thing with this system here with carbon-12 is you can then populate different resonances. You expect to see these bands moving around simply from the fact that the energy up here is changing relative to where the resonance is sitting. So this is, I thought that could be fun to measure. You expect, in principle, you expect to see this kind of pattern that Koshennikov was predicting for many of these states. So he talked about this one here and about this one here, 2- and 1+. So this discussion goes back a long time, actually. It goes back all the way to the 30s from the lab of Lord Rutherford at the Cavendish. So here's just a picture of how this works. So, and this was one of the very first experiments done with an accelerator, with the Cockcron-Walton type accelerator. So they asked exactly the question: what happens if you shoot a proton on boron 11 and then make 3 alpha particles? It can either be that they are emitted somehow in an equal way, sharing the energy directly, or that the one is going in one direction and the 2 is going together in the other direction. So this question is very old in nuclear physics. And then it took a long time because one did not really have detectors. That's why they used this kind of plates at that time. But in the 60s, they started getting semiconductor detectors, and there was this kind of results appearing. And in this case, in 61, if you read here, he says, Ergebnisse durch den gleichzeitigen Zerfall. So it means that they believe for this energy here that they actually emitted simultaneously from this state. I'm a little bit short on time, so here there was shortly after, or relatively shortly after, there was a paper by a person from Glasgow in Great Britain, saying that well, actually, if you have this kind of decay where you go to a final state of 3 alpha particles, you should expect to see interference effects in the final state, because these are 3 bosons, and there should be the final state amplitude should be then symmetric under the exchange of identical bosons. And that leads to cancellation effects in certain area of this plot. So he predicted that, for example, if you take a 2- state, isospin 1, then you should have nothing on the circumference. You should also have nothing in the center. So simply, this is just to illustrate that you get interference effects when you have this kind of phenomenon. So his paper predicted there should be nothing in the middle and nothing on the circumference. And he said it would be of great interest to have data on this. Right. In fact, if you look at other spins and parities, you get other regions that should be cancelled from this effect. And the 1+ state, and this is beginning to explain why this Kosheninikov prediction looked so funny as it did, you get that there should be nothing in these kind of areas here. So that you only have data in these kind of regions here for when you have a 1+ state, isospin 1. I'll skip this in the interest of time. So that you can actually do by doing exactly as they did in the Cavendish laboratory, shooting protons on boron 11 and then measuring what comes out. So this is a little accelerator we have down at our university. In fact, I use it for teaching third-year students most of the time, but we actually did this experiment on that machine. So you see here, these are then these Dali's plots. You see there's a beautiful hole here in the middle, interference between the 3 alpha particles coming out for a 2- state, whereas for the 2+ state, there is actually constructive interference in the middle instead of destructive interference. And it looks pretty much like what the Germans were missioning 61, but now just much better statistics. And we can now compare these data to this kind of model that I briefly surfed over based on R matrix theory. And it more or less describes this data pretty well. So now just to show you, this is an old result, but this is using the beta decay that I started this seminar talking about. We managed to measure this decay that Kosheninikov was talking about, this 1+ state, and you get this flower-like structure, and you have then these lines of no data corresponding to the cancellation for a 1+ state due to symmetry effects. I will go into more detail about this. And then so I've spent some years to try to see, can we provide such data also for some of the other states, not only what we can populate at home or in beta decay, but also other energies. So one way to do this is to go to Madrid, where they have this tandem accelerator that we've done some experiments on. Then we can populate using another reaction. Helium-3 on boron 10. We could populate the 2-, the 1+ again, and also the state here that. So I plot you here what the expectation is for where these bands should be and where the cancellation should be, and it works pretty well. So we now have a pretty good measurement of how all these states decay and how the decay patterns look like. We can even compare different types of models. So this so-called democratic model is what Kosheninikov was calculating in his paper back in 1990. And this model here is the one that is best. And this is the type of model based on R matrix theory that I briefly told you about. Then I have also tried to engage, or I shouldn't say it like that, we have a collaboration, Axel Jensen, Eduardo Garrido, and Dimitri Fedorov, that some of the people Tobias and Marcelo at least work with. So we tried to calculate these spectra, not only using this kind of phenomenological R matrix theory, but using Faddeev equations, kind of 3-body equations in a specific way that this group of people are using in coordinate space, and they use something called adiabatic expansion complex rotation. And that does go some way towards explaining these data. It's still such that the R matrix theory, which is more like a fit than a calculation, can describe the data better than a calculation like this. So there's certainly still some work to do, in my opinion, to use this kind of calculation to reproduce such data. That would be nice. I would like to see that. But at least the calculation fulfills the symmetry effect, which is obvious because that's put into the calculation. So this is kind of my conclusion slide, just to come back to what I started with. So we know now a lot about resonances inside this system, and we also know a lot about how they decay. It has been measured, at least. What we don't know, or what I would like to know, is or see, how is it possible to make let's say a microscopic or a calculation based on protons and neutrons and their interaction that calculate these resonances and also calculates how they decay, so that one can understand or get a link, a theoretical description of the link between the structure of this state and how it decays. That is not available at the moment, to the best of my knowledge. So I think there's some work to do, somehow coupling microscopic type calculations to calculations that can calculate what's happening in the final state. Sorry. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans, for this beautiful and very, very interesting presentation. And if anyone has a question, well, this is the time. We have a few minutes. We have a question from Marcello that's beat Tobias a few milliseconds. So, Marcello.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation, Fimbo. I have one question because, okay, Efimov state can be revealed by the measurement of two consecutive states or measure at unitarity. And in nuclear physics, you do not have such conditions. So my question is how the measurement of a single state can probe that this state is an Efimov state if you cannot measure excited states and you are not at unitarity. This is my question.
Let me tell you what these people were thinking, at least. Maybe not answering your question. So this paper here is not the people who actually predicted there was an Efimov state. Maybe I should have shown you that. But the argument in that paper was that if there is an Efimov state, then it has to be at an energy corresponding to all pairs of alpha particles being in the energy corresponding to the resonance, the two-body resonance in between two alpha particles. You probably know more about that than I do. So if that energy is about 92 keV. So if you say that energy is 92 keV for all pairs, that gives you an idea of where the total three-body energy should be. You got that point? So then the idea to say whether there is or there is not such an Efimov state is to see whether there is a state at that energy. So it's not looking for whether all the other predictions for Efimov states are fulfilled. It's just to say, is that prediction that there should be an energy resonance at an energy corresponding to all pairs of particles having the resonant position of the two-body system? That is the argument. I'm not sure whether that makes sense. That's probably easier for you to estimate that for me. Does that make sense? Did you understand the argument?
Yes, yeah? Yes, understood. Yes, but what do you think in nuclear physics is it possible to have a measurement in such context of a 3-alpha particle to see an Efimov states or something similar to this? Because you have Coulomb, so you. I would like to know if you
if I interpret your question, it could be either understood: is it possible for an Efimov state to exist, or is it possible to measure it? Is that is not necessarily the same thing? So so when you say Coulomb, I guess you mean that it's probably not possible for it to exist. Isn't that the argument that you have?
Yes.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. But I would say, if you then answering as an experimentalist, if you tell me there is a state somewhere, I will be able to measure it. I'm quite sure.
Okay.
So, but I'm probably you're right that the Coulomb is not making that possible for this particular case.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Fimbo.
Hi.
Nice to see you. Fimbo, my questions, is just 2 points. First, I want to have it clear. The structure of the Hoyle state is still 3 alphas, or this is something that have allow probability to be in the wave function of the Hoyle state first? This is my first question. If still this image of 3 alphas survives for the Hoyle state or not.
Let me just see whether I can find something to look at while I answer. Yeah. So, of course, it somehow your question relates to the very last thing I said, so, because the structure is not directly observable. What is observable is the energy and the width, and the final state spectra. Right?
And the decay rate that you
yeah, but then you have to tell me what is the relation between what I see in the detector and what is inside the resonance. That is, and in fact, there's a paper that just came out this year I think in Physics Letters B, where some people they calculated. Okay, let's assume we have this structure in the initial state. What is the predicted decay width of the resonance? Let's assume, let's say, it's kind of very schematic. So let's say we have a linear chain of 3 alpha particles. What would be the expected decay width? How do they come through the Coulomb barrier? And then let's say we have another one, equilateral triangle or whatever. So it's kind of a triangle type structure. What would be the expected probability to go through the Coulomb barrier for that structure? Mm-hmm. And these are not the same. So there is the barrier will strongly what shall we say favor certain configurations to decay than others. Experimentally, if you look at the experiment, there's been, I think, 5 measurements within the last decade where people have looked at what are the decay properties of this state, the Hoyle state. The most recent one was done by Bishop, this one at Texas A&M in the US, and that the only case that have been seen is where you have first emitted 1 alpha particle and the 2 others sitting in the resonance of Coulomb. So that's more than 10 to the minus, or at least, or let's say, the limit for some other decay modes is 10 to the minus 4 at that level. So then you have to. So I cannot really, because I don't think there's a very good calculation of the effect of the Coulomb. So whether you can say that the structure of the Hoyle state inside is then that structure, I don't think you can say. But what you can say from the width of this state is that it is to a high degree clustered.
Yes.
Because the width is almost as large as it can be for that excitation energy. So that you cannot sort of afford to have only a small fraction of the state being in the cluster structure, because that would make the width more narrow. So it's pretty safe to say that it's highly clustered, but how those clusters are sitting, I think we need to know a little bit. We need to know better.
To know
if that is pretty safe to conclude.
Okay, this is nice. Okay, so this is still, I mean, this idea of 3 clusters of helium-4 is so far all the indications are
that is pretty safe too. That you can rely on simply from the width being so large.
Yeah.
And that also applies to this stuff up here, because that's even I mean, the fact that they are more wide is because they're higher above the threshold, but these structures above are probably also cluster structures to a high degree.
Okay, that's nice. And the other questions is about, I didn't understand why the peak, I think, was in the gamma ray spectrum. That excluded the Efimov possibility of the Hoyle state. This I couldn't get this.
Let's see whether I can go back and find this. As this one here. Well, the argument is that if this state is even closer to the threshold than the Hoyle state is, it's just 200 keV above the threshold. Then it's seeing an even higher Coulomb barrier. So for this state, although it is in the continuum, to decay, it has to go through an even larger Coulomb barrier, right? And this is the energy dependence, or the dependence on the decay width on the Coulomb barrier height is exponential, as you know from gamma theory. So that means that most likely, if such a state would exist at that energy, it would mainly decay by electromagnetic decay.
Okay, now I got. And then the little peak. Okay, I understand. So the idea is that the 3 alphas are inside the barrier. Something like that.
Yes, yeah, that's the idea, yes.
Yes.
And that they are, otherwise they would not be there. You could argue that it's there, but it's not populated in this decay. But then you would have to explain why that is.
Yeah, but why not the Hoyle state to be just a migration of an Efimov state?
That's alluding a little bit to what Marcelo was asking, I think.
Yes.
But then you have to tell me why it's an Efimov state. So you're saying why not? So I could ask why.
No, I have my own idea. We can adiabatically switch on the Coulomb repulsion and follow this state, going to the continuum. I think we made some kind of schematic calculation, many years ago.
Yeah, okay.
But it's just a migration. But then when you said, now it is excluded, this possibility.
No, I wouldn't say that. I'm not saying that but then I guess the interesting question would be, what property of the Hoyle state would you predict from saying that it's an Efimov state that I could measure?
Yeah.
That would be nice. If you could tell me that, then I can try to measure it.
Okay, very good. Maybe we have to open again our old stuff. But okay, so that's a good point. Thank you, Pino.
So I don't see other questions. I just want to make a comment, actually, a thank you for having raised this point about the state to be a real 12 body states or a 4 alpha state. This is something that always interested me, and very curious point. And also for the point in your result that you raised that there are no microscopic, or it's very difficult to make microscopic calculation about resonance state, that I think is very inspiring, because it is still an open problem that people try to solve. So if there are students and people that try to solve this, and I'm telling that being a many-bodist, this is a very interesting point.
Yeah, indeed.
So are there any other questions, curiosities? If not, I think we can thank Hans again for this.
Thank you very much.
And